Good morning. I'm here in my capacity as the Executive Director of NASRA, and I want to thank you for inviting us to be able to attend and to present about the 50 states and what's going on in the public pension community. I'll spend a little bit of time talking about or setting the scene for how why this is an issue for everyone, and obviously it's a very significant issue for the states. It's received a tremendous amount of press coverage. There's been a lot of work being done in the states. So I'm going to give you a highlight of that. My numbers also are going to be aggregate numbers, so I don't want you to think that any individual slide is the reflection on any individual state. It's sort of the aggregate of the entire community. This is just a snapshot, and I only put 4 on here, but I'm sure you're all well aware there are many, many, many reports and studies being done on the public pension community. We focus on the largest state funds in the country. They cover about 85% of the assets and liabilities. Nearly every state in the United States has made modifications to their plan. This first map that I'm showing right here is the first type of adjustments that have been made. These are states that have made changes to the underlying COLA, the cost of living adjustments for retirees, some for future retirees, some for actual current retirees as well. This map shows the increased employee contributions that have been made. This is a very unique feature in the public sector that does not exist in the private sector. Employees in state programs, about 99% of the time, actually make a contribution into their pension program. Very different than defined benefit plans in the private sector under ERISA, which are non-employee driven. They are employer driven. This is my final slide, and there's going to be a compendium of these as well, that shows the states that administer some type of what we call a hybrid or a combination plan, so changes where they've actually gone in and made underlying changes to the structure of the retirement system for their members. Oftentimes this is being done, though, on a future hire basis, although there are a couple of states who are doing it for current employees as well. And I apologize if there's anyone here from Idaho. Idaho actually has made a change as well. They should be colored in that lovely blue color. They made the change to the employee contribution, and it was just recently that they did that, so I have not updated that. The sole state that you see that has not made a change, it's not because they haven't passed legislation to make a change, but that it's been stayed in litigation at this point, and that is the state of Illinois. Types of changes that have been going on. First of all, in 2009, it really began the wave of new changes to retirement systems across the country, quite frankly, in response to the Great Recession and the reduction in asset values for all the pension funds. These are just types of benefit changes that have been made, benefit reductions, increasing the age for retirement. We've seen that go up significantly across the group. Increased use of hybrid plans, and I'll talk a little bit about that and give some examples of that from across the country. The other area that people have primarily focused on is the distribution of risk in these programs. The distribution of risk really pertains to who's taking the asset risk and who's exposed to what's going on with respect to the markets. A couple of different approaches there. We've seen a lot more risk shifted over to the workers in these programs. Many states now, not many, I shouldn't say that, there's probably 6 or 7 states that actually have, if there's volatility in the contribution rate that's based on volatility in either the liabilities or the asset returns, are actually shifting part of that over, and it floats in each individual state. My home state, Nevada, did that and actually shares the contribution rate 50-50 with their employees, and it floats depending on the returns of the program. The one trend that we have not seen but has been spoken about a lot in the press is an overall shift to what we call a defined contribution plan, a 401k approach. There are a number of states that have looked at it but have tended to move back to some sort of middle ground kind of pension program. What we have seen are the states, and of course there's 50 of you, and so there's obviously 50 different ways of doing things, and that's actually what's happened. Is everyone takes what's going on and have tailored those solutions to their own state, worked with their employees, worked with their employers to come to a tailored solution that addresses what they believe are the issues facing their pension funds. These are the elements that we think are important and that have been retained by most states with respect to making changes to their pension funds. First of all, mandatory participation, employee and employer cost sharing, and I have a slide that will show you that the sort of the aggregate numbers there. Benefit adequacy, we have states that participate in Social Security, but we also have states that do not participate in Social Security. That's a very important element when you're considering plan design, whether or not there's any sort of threshold poverty prevention plan if you're a non-Social Security state. And then the other unique thing about public sector pension plans is they often also administer supplemental plans, death and disability or survivor and disability programs. These are designed as, they're not the actual retirement benefit, but for perhaps particularly in public safety, important for those that their very jobs put them at risk. Making sure that your assets are pooled and professionally managed. States do a very good job trying to make sure that the costs associated with these programs come down, although there is a wide array of fees out there in the states. And then this last one is the required annuitization. This is a way that you do not outlive the benefit that has been accumulated to you, which is one of the, I think, distinguishing features in the public sector. I'm just putting this up really as a way to take you to the facts after it, because we've seen over and over again, particularly in the popular press, discussions of what we perceive are the misperceptions about the public pension community. Number one, and this is a theme that has been passed many, many times, that pensions themselves are causing the municipal bankruptcy that you've seen. Detroit particularly is one that has been a central focus for us. Public pension plans take too much risk, and the investment return assumptions are too high. Few workers benefit from the current system of benefits, and that federal regulation in some fashion is needed to prevent some kind of a bailout. So what I'm going to do now is take you through the actual data that we have around the public pension plan. The Public Funds Survey is a survey of the largest 126 public pension plans in the United States. That's fully 85% of the assets and liabilities. We focus on those because they are a good marker for what's going on, although I will tell you it does not cover many, many local and municipal plans. There are states with significant numbers of municipal plans, and this data does not cover that group. We do update this yearly, and it's done from all of the consolidated annual financial reports and actuarial valuations that are published concerning these 126 funds. And both NASRA and our teacher counterpart, the National Council on Teacher Retirement, support the efforts to do this research. This is a chart we use to show the sort of spread of actuarially calculated funded ratio for the programs, and the size of the bubbles are relative to the size of the assets and liabilities of the plan. So I'm sure if you take a look at that, you can tell that the two largest bubbles are CalPERS and CalSTRS, the two largest defined benefit public pension plans in the United States. You can't see it, but we actually do have a plan that's actually covered by the L in my levels. We have a public safety plan, a small public safety plan that's about 140% funded. But then all the way similarly down to the small bubble at the bottom, we have those that are also significantly underfunded. This represents the change in the actuarial value of assets over time. So these are not relative to one another, but it's you want to take a look at the relative change in liabilities. Liabilities were at the high back in 2002, and then the relative change in those liabilities has shrunk over time, meaning the liabilities aren't growing at the same pace as they once were. And then, of course, you see the effect of the Great Recession on the assets, and now the assets are coming back. This slide is the actuarial value of assets and liabilities funding levels, and then there's a projection because many of the pension funds use a technique called smoothing, where they're rolling in their assets over time to smooth out the volatility in the contribution rates. And what we've done is we've projected those smooth assets in over the next 4 years to show the relative change in the projected unfunded accrued liabilities and the funding ratio, which is something that all of you consider when you're looking at your public pension plans. What we see happening is what you would expect to happen after the last 3 years of positive economic growth, that they are rebounding as well. Public pension plans are creatures of the marketplace, And as the markets rebound, so do the assets of the pension funds. Looking at this is a slightly different picture. This is the ratio of active members to retirees. And what I have circled on the slide is actually, I think, the most important thing for you to take away from this. That is the relative change in active members, which means your active employee base has gone down over the last 5 years, basically continuously since the beginning of the recession. This is a picture of the annualized change in wages and salaries, public to private. We use the Census Bureau data to do this calculation. And you can see basically from 2010 through 2014, you have flat or basically negative growth in employee compensation. And that is also impacting how your pension funds make their contributions. Monthly relative change in employment. This is what you would expect as you're looking at the difference between the private sector and the public sector. Private sector goes through a deeper dive during the recessionary period and then actually surges back at a much quicker pace. This follows your tax revenue issues as well, so you don't see the growth back in your own employees until much later. It's a slower curve for a rebound in public sector employment. This is one more picture of payroll. This is the actual covered or reported payroll to the pension funds, the 126 that are in our public funds survey. And what you see for the last 4 years is basically flat or negative payroll growth. So individually, when you're calculating a contribution rate, you're calculating it typically on a steady or growing payroll. And when you have negative payroll growth, you have fewer dollars, fewer people, so your individual contribution rate goes up even though the assets or the liabilities really haven't changed that much, but the percentage cost has changed per person. This is a picture of the median contribution rates, and we split it into two groups because we try and pull out the Social Security states. Social Security states tend to have much higher contributions, or they look relatively higher because there is no 12.4% going off to the federal government. So you have to add in the addition of the 12.4% to the contribution costs on the left-hand side of the screen, meaning those that are participating in Social Security. So it's a combination of what you see as an employer cost and employee cost, plus the FICA tax that is then paid to the Social Security system. Employers without Social Security, as you see, you have a higher employer contribution and a higher employee contribution. The aggregate here that you see does mask those states that do a 50-50 cost share with their employees. A lot of people talk about what we call the actuarial required contribution. That term is going away in an accounting perspective. They're replacing that term with what a term called the actuarially determined calculation. When the GASB board came out with their new pronouncements for how you report the assets or the financial statements for not only the pension funds but for the employers participating, they made a statement that basically said they were getting out of the funding business, so they're no longer going to be telling states and pension funds what is required to fund their programs. What they're focused now on and what is required to be disclosed about their pension funds. So they deliberately made a calculation for the financial statements that could not be used for funding your programs. So your programs now have sort of a split between what is a funding requirement and what is an accounting requirement, and I'll talk about that a little bit more in just a little while. We, on the funding side of it, will continue to use actuarially required contributions because as states develop their own funding policies, how they meet those funding policies, the actuarially required contribution is designed to do that. So they're all individually done. This slide it shows you the efforts that have been made to make the actuarially required contributions over the entire nation. And so back, obviously, at the height of the markets, back as the go-go 90s went away in 2001, 103% of the actuarially required contribution was coming into these programs. And then over time, the biggest dip is in 2011, where on aggregate, pension funds were receiving 86% of the annual required contribution. This is a picture of what that actually looks like fund by fund. The median was 99%, and this is when you talk about, are we actually making our obligations? Are the states doing what they're supposed to be doing? You can clearly see that many, many states are making all of the required contributions into their programs. But then, of course, you can see also that there are a few that are really struggling with that, and that will continue, I think, into the near future. Turning now to asset allocations, that's another one of the misperceptions about taking more risk on. This is the average asset allocation for the entire community from 01 to 13 by asset class. The bottom bar is the equity exposure, then fixed income, then real estate, then alternatives, and cash and other cash equivalents. You have seen a growth in alternatives in real estate over the last decade, but what you've seen is that replacing the exposure in the equity market. So it's a replacement of a type of risk, but not really a change so much in that risk. Most of that is being done on an organic basis, really more for purposes of diversification, which is a way to actually manage risk going over time. So it's not changing or upping the level of the total risk of these portfolios. Rather, it's diversifying the portfolios so that they can maintain a type of return that is necessary to fund the programs over the long periods of time that these funds are in the markets for. This is the picture of the 2013 median return numbers, and what I always take away from this is what is highlighted there is what a difference 6 months makes. Those that had fiscal year ends that were June 30, the 5-year number, so this is the annualized return number for the 5-year period preceding that date, 2013, that number was 5.3. But if you shifted your fiscal year to the end of the year, December 31st, your same 5-year number actually goes up to 12.5. What I take away from this slide is returns are very time period dependent, and you need to be careful when you're making decisions about what you want to do over the longer term. Those return numbers stabilize as they go farther and farther out. You see much more significant volatility in the shorter time periods. This is the median investment returns for the periods ending June 30. We don't have, obviously, the end of the year returns yet for those with fiscal year ends on 12/31. Basically, the 1 year, the 3-year, the 5-year are all above typically what we think of as the 7.5% to 8% return assumption that's being made by the systems themselves. And then, of course, the longer term period. Where you see that the effects of the economic recession are in the 10-year number here. This is a picture of the total community, the assets and the rebound in those assets. This is as of the 2013 fiscal year ends. This number now is closer to $4 trillion at the end of June 30, 2014. Here's another area where you'll hear a lot of discussion concerning what is the assumption, what is the investment assumption used by the public pension plans, and is it too high? We have had significant downward pressure to move the investment return assumptions down over time, and that actually has occurred. You still see 41 systems at the 8% return assumption, but 81 systems have actually moved below that, and the trend is to move those down more and more over time. This has been happening really in the last 3 years. You've seen this, and obviously it's been in reaction to what's going on in the investment markets. Turning again to the cost associated with the public pension funds and how you manage your human resource costs at the states. One of the things people think about when they're talking about public pension costs is how expensive they are. And we've done this research is research that we do at the Public Funds Survey, but it is also research that is done by the Center for Retirement Research at Boston College, trying to plot what the actual cost relative to total budget expenditures are. That is with the exception of non-direct expenditures. So this is the percentage of direct general expenditures where your pension costs are. The actual high for pension costs as a component of your budgets was back in 1982 when it was a little bit over 5% of general fund expenditures. We are now about median for the cost for that time period, but of course, as your revenues have gone up, so have that relative percentage on a dollar basis is much higher. This is just another picture of that same number, but to show you again, we're trying to do it without intergovernmental transfers, which include the federal funding issues. So this is how it looks on state-based taxes, or expenditures, I should say. So turning now to, there's a tremendous amount of confusion about the numbers that are used to calculate both the actuarially required contribution, how you're going to be disclosing these numbers going forward under GASB 67 and GASB 68. And then, of course, the rating agencies have also all weighed in on pension liabilities and how they're going to be using those to be calculating your bond ratings as you go out to the general markets to issue, to do bond issuances. First is books, and this is the GASB disclosure number that I was just speaking of. This is computing an annual position regarding your pensions for financial statements. This is going to be a volatile number that goes up and down depending on the relative position of your pension funds year over year. But that is the way GASB has decided to do it, and as I've said, they've done that partly to get out of the funding business, so they no longer want you to disclose on the basis of what you're funding your plan at, but what on the calculation of the efforts that you're making to make your your contributions. The bond rating agencies, you actually have three different approaches that are being used by the three different large bond rating agencies. The most significant one that's, I think, made the most press and has done the most work in this area is Moody's. Moody's uses a formula now where they're basically calculating your total debt load, and employees are part of that. The pension funds are part of that. That calculation is different than what Fitch is doing. Fitch is taking the entire community and applying a 7% discount rate for your liabilities, which creates a uniform approach, but one that is relatively different, actually state to state. And then Standard & Poor's has made no changes in how they're calculating your liabilities, because basically S&P will tell you that they completely understand where the debt loads are for the states, and they don't actually need to make any adjustments to be able to do their evaluations of your ability to go to market. And then finally, budgets. That's the actuarially required contribution calculation that there's a group called the Big Seven, of which CSG is part of, that has done a publication on the things to consider while you're doing your funding policies and how you calculate your actuarially required contribution. Just one slide on bankruptcy, very, very quickly. Only 12 states specifically authorize Chapter 9. It is not used to provide any type of federal bailout. Detroit is the issue that most people have talked about, and how this is a relative issue for the public pension plans across the country. There are only about, I want to say, I think it's less than 4% of municipalities that have been utilized Chapter 9. The Detroit bankruptcy is actually getting ready to come to a close. At least right now, that's the case, because they have negotiated a grand bargain where the employees are all taking both pension cuts and pay cuts in order to emerge from bankruptcy as well. And then it is uniquely designed to allow municipalities to continue to do their work while going through basically a restructuring of their debts. Notable outcomes in 2014. California legislature put together, along with the governor, a plan to put CalSTRS on a path to full funding. It's a controversial plan. It was completely approved by the legislature and, of course, signed into law by the governor. But there are those that are still concerned about it, because it does shift a tremendous amount of cost to the school districts in California. Oklahoma legislature just passed a defined contribution plan for all new hires and closed their DB plan for their current workforce only. Hybrids taking effect in 2014. Kentucky has a cash balance plan. Cash balance plans are very similar to defined benefit pension plans. They are mandatory annuitizations, but they're based on the amount of assets in any individual asset, or any individual account. Tennessee has what we call a combination plan, DB, a smaller defined benefit with a piece that is also now being funded under a defined contribution plan, similarly to Virginia, which also is doing the same thing. This is my final slide. The trend or pace of reform has slowed significantly, and I think the reason for that is all 50 states have done some type of reform and are now taking a look to see how those reforms have played out against the relative competing budget constraints that you have. And so I think that's going to continue. Pennsylvania, we spoke about this a little bit yesterday. I think the reform battle will continue in Pennsylvania, where they have very significant challenges, not just with respect to their pension funds, but with respect to underlying the budget issues in Pennsylvania as well. The issue with many changes is the fact that if you do not engage your employees ahead of time or as part of the process of reform, you do get litigation. And litigation has stopped many of the reforms in their tracks because of that. We're still looking for resolution in Colorado, Illinois, and Oregon. Pension costs are stabilizing, as you saw from my previous slides. However, that does not mean that costs will not rise for those funds that are still in significant underfunded status. And then I think the other area that as policymakers you'll need to take a look at is longevity. Longevity risk, that's true for all of us in this country. It's a good thing and a bad thing when you look at pension funds, because the longer people live, the more you pay out, and so you want to be careful to make sure that you're taking that into consideration when funding your programs. I think investment return assumptions and the discount rate will be part of the debate ongoing for at least the next few years. And then, of course, we still haven't seen the actual imposition of GASB. It's going to start with this most recent fiscal year end, so that will be something that you'll be facing as well. And I'm happy to answer any questions that you have.